Okay, so in this talk, I'd like to share some findings from a project that explores how large global corporations are discursively addressing the climate crisis and how they use language strategically to respond to mounting public and institutional pressure for climate action. I should begin by acknowledging that the work I'm about to present is co-authored with my brilliant colleague from the Birmingham Business School, Annika Bielitz. So the study has also, the study I'll present has been published in Applied Corpus Linguistics. It's just come out and it's in open access, so all of you can find it and read it if you're interested. In the talk, I'll give you some highlights of the main sort of findings from the study, but you can read the full analysis, and there's a lot more analysis and discussion and interpretation in the paper itself. All right, so as we all know, and as we can indeed increasingly see all around us, the climate crisis is speeding up. Extreme weather events caused by climate change are becoming more frequent and more destructive. The science about this is very clear and has been very clear for a long time. The main cause of this is rising carbon emissions. However, despite many attempts by governments and international organizations to try to agree a strategy to reduce these emissions, they are still going up. Now, usually when we read, hear, or participate in discussions around climate change, there's a lot of emphasis on what governments should do. The debate also often centers around what individuals can do to play their part in tackling the crisis through different kinds of consumption choices. And while all of this is certainly important, there is a third key player that until recently has received limited scrutiny, namely corporations. Now, corporations are responsible for a significant chunk of the carbon emissions released into the atmosphere. A report published a couple of years ago found that just 100 companies are responsible for over 2/3 of all emissions. Now, fossil fuel companies in particular have a big role to play in tackling the climate crisis because their investment decisions are going to have a real impact on where the energy is going to come from in the future and on carbon emission rates as a result. So where are the staggering profits that these companies are racking up going to be invested? Is the money going to be invested in transformative sort of technologies, in renewables, or is it going to be invested in more fossil fuel projects, as a recent investigative report by The Guardian suggests? Now, these are some of the considerations that motivated Annika and myself to explore the climate change discourse of the top corporate polluters in a study that came out a couple of years ago in IJCL. Now, that study focused on so-called carbon majors, the most polluting fossil fuel, coal, and mining companies. In that study, we looked at how these companies have responded to the landmark Paris Agreement using Van Lowen's discursive legitimation framework to analyze how they have sought to justify and defend their actions and plans in the face of growing public and institutional pressure. Now, the study I'm going to talk about today is a follow-up to this particular study. And it follows up by significantly broadening the scope of our analysis to include all of the 500 world's largest corporations. And it also zooms in on a particular feature that our analysis of the carbon majors discourse has shown to be really important, namely net zero pledges. So this is a graph that shows from the previous study that shows one of the standout findings from it. And as you can see here, the frequency of the phrase net zero has increased really rapidly over the past, well, between 2018 and 2020. So that suggests that companies are kind of following in the footsteps of the growing number of countries around the world that in recent years have legally committed to becoming carbon neutral, normally by 2050. However, corporate net zero pledges have also been criticized by experts and different media outlets because they're often based on questionable data and practices such as carbon offsetting, carbon capture, and storage technologies, which are simply inadequate to address the problem given its scale. So in light of all this, in this new follow-up study, we wanted to hone in on this phrase net zero and study corporate net zero pledges in more detail to explore their linguistic and rhetorical features. So as I mentioned just now, the study expands the range of companies beyond just the top polluters to include the 500 largest corporations in the world. And the overarching question that we are interested in is quite simple. So how do major global corporations communicate their net zero goals? How credible, how serious are these goals? Are global corporations genuinely committed to tackling the climate crisis, or is net zero just the latest corporate environmental buzzword? To address these questions, we use a corpus-assisted discourse analysis approach where we're combining quantitative techniques like frequency and collocate analysis with detailed discourse analysis of relevant sort of examples and extracts from corporate texts. Now, before I show you I go into the analysis and show you some results, let me just give you a brief overview of the concept and history of net zero, which is central to our study. Now, corporate neutrality is the latest climate target designed to tackle the climate emergency. It means balancing carbon emissions released into the atmosphere with carbon emissions removed, resulting in net zero, no overall increase. Now, the concept is strongly associated with the Paris Agreement of 2015. However, the Paris Agreement itself actually did not mention net zero as such. The term was first used in the milestone report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018. Now, as I said before, recent years have seen a real flurry of net zero pledges by countries worldwide. As of October 2025, around 145 companies had announced or are considering net zero targets, including countries like China, the EU, obviously the EU is not just a country, a group of countries, and India. Now, all of these countries together cover almost 77% of global emissions. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there is also an increasing number of companies who have made similar pledges. However, just how many of them have done so and who these companies are is not clear. So one of the, if you like, byproducts of our project is essentially a map of the net zero pledges among the world's largest business organizations. Now, for our analysis of net zero pledges, we compiled a specialized corpus of sustainability reports published in across 3 years by Fortune Global 500 companies. This became a massive corpus, actually, of like over 1,200 documents and almost 63 million words. It took a long time to build, and it is a really useful resource. We are not able to share it publicly for copyright reasons, but it's still something that we might be able to share in other ways if you're interested. Right. we also grouped companies by world regions, development status, company ownership, and industry sectors to enable us to do different kinds of comparisons. And the reports were mainly downloaded from a repository called Corporate Register. And where we couldn't find any reports for a particular company, we also consulted their own websites. Now, briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with sustainability reports, these are detailed documents that are released by most major global corporations every year, and which contain a lot of information about social and environmental impacts that a company generates and the plans and actions that companies pursue to address these impacts. The topics covered are varied. They include obviously climate change, but also things like energy use, pollution, diversity, health and safety, human rights, employee welfare, and so on and so forth. So sustainability reports really are a great resource for studying corporate discourse on a wide range of ideologically and politically sensitive issues, not least because they're really easy to get hold of. Most of these you can just download from companies' websites or via the repository I just mentioned. Now, alongside sustainability reports, some companies have also started publishing dedicated climate reports, which is an interesting instance of changing discursive practices, given a changing world and a changing ideological landscape. Other companies have a different kind of policy where they put together financial and non-financial information into a combined integrated report. So what we did in building our corpus is essentially just hoover up everything that we could. So when there were multiple reports, we just collected all of them. As I said at the start, we combined corpus and discourse approaches to analyze our data. We use a combination of Sketch Engine and a bit of R for the more involved corpus queries and data visualization. Our workflow is quite standard corpus-assisted discourse analysis. We start with broad level quantitative analysis, mainly frequency and collocate analysis, which we use then to identify useful entry points into our data for more in-depth qualitative analysis. So let's have a look at some results now. As a first step in the analysis, we were interested in looking at general quantitative patterns in the corpus. So first of all, how many companies talk about net zero in their reports? How prominent is this topic? What we found is that overall, 73.6% of companies mentioned net zero. So that's over 2/3 of our sample. This confirms what we found in our previous study and what lots of different media outlets have already observed and pointed out. The companies are kind of jumping on the net zero train quite enthusiastically. However, as you can see from this plot, there is considerable variation in the data, with several industries containing extreme outliers. You can see the spread is quite considerable. Some companies are just like, can't get enough of net zero talk. Other companies are more cautious. So this suggests that while most Fortune Global 500 companies are referencing net zero in their disclosures, some are engaging with this concept more assertively than others. Now, some of these extreme outliers are shown in this plot. As you can see here, financial services dominate this list, although I should say that these are also the largest group of Fortune Global 500 companies. The wealthiest corporations and largest corporations are financial services corporations. So this is an example now of one such net zero pledge by by Legal & General, which is an insurance company. Now, this is quite a strongly worded pledge. The company conveys a really strong and resolute commitment to net zero through the use of the deontic modal must. and evaluative language like drastically and devastating, which signal urgency and a strong commitment to action. The company is also using we here in an inclusive sense to align itself with collective responsibility and to position itself as a leader in the so-called transition to net zero. This extract also shows the use of journey metaphorical expressions, towards and roadmap. This metaphorical framing of sustainability as a journey has long been a staple of corpus sustainability discourse, and it is pervasive across our corpus as well, as I'll show you shortly. Finally, the company portrays its climate ambitions as fully and unproblematically compatible with, and even beneficial to, its business objectives and shareholder value, as they like to put it. This is suggested by the evaluative adjective secure here, which is used to describe the returns promised to shareholders. In other words, environmental responsibility is discursively constructed not as a constraint, but as a source of long-term financial stability. Now, perhaps surprisingly, among the top biggest corporate fans of net zero, we also find 4 oil and gas companies. BP is leading the pack here. If you look at their 2020 and 2021 reports, they make a very big deal of carbon neutrality and place it at the center of their rebranding strategy. This is very similar to the previous rebranding overhaul they had in the early 2000s when they replaced their legacy Shield logo with the new sunflower logo to signal a shift towards renewables, a shift which to my knowledge at least has been only partial. In any case, this seems like a bold move for an oil company whose products are the main cause of climate change in the first place. So such strong emphasis does raise the question about exactly how BP is going to achieve net zero and how credible their pledges truly are, especially when we know that, as I showed at the start, BP and other fossil fuel companies have a lot of massive oil and gas development projects in the pipeline. There is also a lot of interesting multimodal stuff going on here, which I don't have time to go into, but I'd love to discuss with you in the Q&A. Now, Legal & General and BP are examples of companies that, at least rhetorically, have embraced the net zero agenda. However, just as there is variation in terms of how often companies talk about net zero in their reports, there is significant variation also in how ambitious their commitments are. So to probe this, for instance, we looked at 200 concordance lines, 200 random concordance lines containing the term net zero, followed by the term scope, within a span of 10 words from each other. Now, we chose the term scope because it is the term that is used to describe different kinds of emissions. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from the company's own operations only. Scope 2 emissions covers indirect emissions from input materials and input materials and labor and activities. So purchased energy, electricity, or heat to power a power plant or a server farm, for instance, would feature as Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions include all the other indirect emissions throughout the value chain, particularly and importantly, including emissions from the use of the products. So the concordance lines, as you can see here in the bottom left corner, shows that 57% of these concordance lines included a reference of all emission scopes, which is, I guess, encouraging. But still, 43% of them only focused on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, unsurprisingly, many of these more limited pledges are from Oil and gas companies whose products inevitably generate emissions when used. So it's kind of impossible, I would say, unless there is a concrete commitment to transitioning away from fossil fuels, for these companies to pledge anything about Scope 3 emissions. Now, most fossil fuel companies just avoid talking about Scope 3 emissions altogether. But there is one example that we found in the corpus of an American company actually arguing their case about why they don't want to set Scope 3 emissions. And they do so in a rather unsatisfactory way. So essentially here, they're claiming that they shouldn't be accountable for Scope 3 emissions because they only refine the oil, only dig up the oil, and they don't sell it directly to end users. So they should not be held responsible for these emissions coming from the use of the products. This reasoning obviously shifts responsibility downstream while also downplaying the company's broader role in maintaining society's fossil fuel dependence, the main driver of climate change. More broadly, this example illustrates that frequent references to net zero do not automatically signal deep or transformative change, which in the case of oil and gas companies would likely require divestment from fossil fuels, something we see very limited evidence of in our corpus. Now, these findings highlight the importance of context. To understand how Fortune Global 500 companies frame net zero and position themselves in relation to it, it's not enough to look at whether they just mention net zero. We need to also examine how they talk about it. To explore this, we looked at collocates of net zero within a context window of 4 words before and after. The table here shows the top 20 collocates. Now, what stands out immediately here is the abundance of journey metaphorical expressions, which confirms the findings of our own previous study and a lot of similar studies before it. In fact, if you go back into the literature to a classic study by Marcus Milne and colleagues published some 20 years ago, there you have it. The journey metaphor was still there. Was already there, and it's still here. So the goal has shifted from a loosely defined sustainability to net zero. But the way this the shift, the change is construed is still in terms of a journey. Now, critics of the journey metaphor in corporate discourse have argued that it functions mainly as an impression management device. It's used by companies to portray themselves as on the path to, as moving towards sustainable development, and by doing so, they're buying themselves some time. As a thought experiment, think about how different these extracts would read if instead of a journey metaphor, the shift to net zero was framed as a race or as a fight against time. It would be a very different story. Now, the collocate list also highlights a lot of what we may call commissive collocates, words that signal intention and that signal different degrees of intention towards the goal of net zero. Interestingly, ambition is the top collocate of net zero, followed by commitment. Obviously, these two terms convey rather different degrees of resolution, of resolve towards net zero. Commitment suggests, obviously, binding action, sustained effort. It's what Searle would have called a commissive speech act, a promise to act. By contrast, the most common collocate, ambition, conveys aspiration or desire. It operates more as an expressive speech act, communicating a psychological stance rather than a concrete plan. So from this perspective, the stronger association between net zero and ambition can be interpreted as a form of hedging. Companies signal awareness and intent, but avoid binding targets that might be difficult to meet within the existing capitalistic paradigm. This, we argue, allows them to maintain strategic flexibility while still participating in net zero discourse. Here's an example of a net zero pledge framed as an ambition by the American multinational conglomerate General Electric. Now, it's interesting to see here that there is a sort of double hedge. So it's not just an ambition, but it's a path to the ambition. So yeah, not the most kind of assertive and convincing pledge, I would say. Okay, so the finding about the frequency of ambition ties in well with another key result from our study. One of our aims was to identify the concrete solutions Fortune Global 500 companies propose to reduce emissions and reach net zero, and to see which strategies are most prominent in the discourse. To do this, we created a subcorpus of concordance lines containing the words reduce and emissions within a 10-word span. From this subcorpus, we extracted the 1,000 most frequent lemmas, and we grouped them into 12 categories of common emission reduction targets. Strategies. Now, to make this process a little bit more efficient and a little bit more bearable, we used Google Gemini LLM to automate the classification of the words. However, we manually reviewed the Gemini's classifications, paying special attention to words that seemed ambiguous or potentially misclassified. And where necessary, we checked random concordance lines and corrected any errors. So, for example, Gemini initially classified the word climate under emission reduction targets. However, when we examined the concordance lines, we found that the term was used in many different contexts and did not clearly point to a specific solution. We therefore reclassified it as, put it in the category of other, which is a catch-all category for multifunctional items. Overall, agreement between the human coders, because there was two of us coding, and Gemini was 84.3%, which is considerable, and shows that LLMs can help at least make repetitive and tedious analysis tasks more efficient and bearable. Okay, so here are the results when we put all of the words and all the categories together. What we find is that emission reduction targets is by far the most common type of net zero strategy, if we can call it that, adopted by Fortune Global 500 companies, followed by energy efficiency, disclosure and reporting, and renewable energy transition, but far down. Perhaps surprisingly, but also encouragingly, carbon capture and storage and carbon offsetting were the least frequent mentioned strategies. And one possible explanation is that there's just too much heat on those strategies, too much controversy around them, which might have put off companies from openly discussing and promoting them as they used to do, perhaps a couple of years ago. Okay, so this is an example, just to give you an example of target setting. We expect to further reduce carbon emissions, aiming for 50% reduction, 80% reduction by 2040, 100% carbon neutral by 2050. So there's a lot of this kind of language in these reports. Okay, final bit of results. We found that one of the strongest collocates on net zero was Alliance. And this initially surprised us because we're like, Alliance, what are they talking about? So we went into the corpus and looked at this more closely, and we found that Alliance, net zero Alliance, is a term that is used exclusively by financial services corporations. And it turns out that these corporations have set up a whole bunch of different sector-wide alliances, like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, like all sorts of these, I guess, industry groups or industry collectives that are supposedly kind of coming up with common strategies for addressing climate change. So following Van Loen, we consider this as a type of legitimation by authority, where companies are aligning themselves with institutions and organizations that are perceived as credible and legitimate. So by joining these alliances, talking about these alliances, these companies are portraying themselves as a united front or firmly committed to addressing this common goal of combating climate change. Now, the interesting thing here is that obviously these organizations are created by the industry itself. So a critical or perhaps cynical analysis of this is that the real function of these organizations is to convey the idea that the industry is capable of self-managing itself, making state intervention and regulatory intervention less needed. Okay, let me wrap up then with a couple of takeaways. I think what our analysis shows is that net zero has rapidly become a central feature of corporate discourse. However, there is still a lot of variation in terms of how much attention different companies pay to this concept and how ambitious and comprehensive their plans actually are. Corporate language, we found, is often weakly committal, framing net zero as a journey or as an ambition, which suggests that net zero is predominantly a form of aspirational talk rather than really a serious display, if you like, of transformative change. Now, this is corroborated by the findings about the proposed solutions, which still focus really heavily on targets and reporting, with less emphasis on deeper structural change. The changes, the concrete changes that are proposed and promoted, fit within a techno-optimistic frame centered on efficiency and renewables. And I'm not suggesting that renewables are not important. Obviously, they are crucial, but we need to understand the global sort of frame within which these measures are proposed. A final sort of caveat is about the changing geopolitical landscape that I think, you know, is already having a huge impact on what corporations worldwide are doing, what different countries worldwide are doing. With Donald Trump's presidency, we've already seen lots of rollbacks, especially in the oil, gas, and finance sectors, where some of these alliances I was talking about, they've been dismantled. Some of the oil companies, including BP, by the way, have walked back from their bold climate commitments. So the landscape is shifting really quickly, which does raise further questions about, I think, the sincerity of these and the viability of these pledges. It also highlights how important it is to keep studying this, I think, to keep track of how the corporate world is positioning itself and shaping the conversation around climate change. That is all I had. Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for listening.